The candles in the dining hall of Ashford Manor flickered as a glass shattered against the marble floor. Cordelia Ashford had thrown it there on purpose, her eyes locked on her younger sister Margox, who sat quietly at the far end of the table. Everyone froze. The butler rushed forward with a cloth, but the damage to the evening was already done. Guests whispered behind their hands. Lord Edmund Ashford, the girl's father, forced a smile and asked the servants to bring fresh glasses, pretending nothing had happened. This was the night Duke Alastair Vance was expected to arrive, and Cordelia had wanted every eye in the room fixed on her before he walked through the door. Instead, she had drawn attention to the one sister she wished would disappear. Margox did not flinch. She reached down, picked up a shard of glass from near her shoe, and placed it gently on a napkin. She said nothing because she rarely did. Her silence was not weakness. It was a shield she had built over many years, ever since a fever in her childhood had left her voice fragile and her spirit even more so, though few people ever bothered to understand the second part. Most in the county only knew the rumor. The youngest Ashford girl barely speaks, so she must have little to say. The doors of the hall opened, and Duke Alastair Vance entered, tall and composed, dressed simply for a man of his rank. He was not fond of large gatherings, but his mother, Lady Eleanor Vance, had insisted he attend. She had grown tired of empty rooms in their family estate and wanted grandchildren before she grew too old to enjoy them. Alastair had agreed to this dinner only to keep peace at home, expecting a night of forced smiles and shallow conversation. He had no idea that the broken glass on the floor was the first sign of a much larger storm brewing beneath the surface of this house. Lord Ashford greeted him warmly, perhaps too warmly, and guided him toward the table. Cordelia straightened her posture immediately, arranging her expression into practiced charm. Seraphina, the middle sister, offered a brighter smile, one that had convinced many suitors before him that she was the most delightful woman in the room. Margox remained seated, her hands folded, her eyes lowered just enough to seem polite rather than distant. The Duke greeted each sister in turn. Cordelia spoke first, praising his family name and asking about his estate with practiced interest. Seraphina followed, her laughter a little too quick, her compliments a little too smooth. When he reached Margox, she looked up and offered a small nod, along with two quiet words. "Good evening." That was all. No flattery, no attempt to impress him. Alastair found himself oddly caught by it. In a room full of people trying to win his attention, here was someone who seemed to want nothing from him at all. Lord Ashford, eager to smooth over the earlier disturbance, guided conversation toward safer subjects, asking Alastair about the condition of the roads leading to his estate and whether the recent rains had damaged the eastern bridge near the county line. Alastair answered politely, though his eyes drifted more than once toward the far end of the table, where Margox sat quietly cutting her food into small, careful pieces, as though the simple act required deliberate attention. He noticed she never once looked toward her sister Cordelia, not out of fear, but with the practiced indifference of someone who had long ago stopped expecting kindness from that direction. Cordelia, sensing the Duke's attention wavering, launched quickly into a description of a recent journey she had taken to the capital, speaking of grand houses and important names with obvious pride. Seraphina interrupted more than once with her own additions to the story, each sister trying to outshine the other in front of their guest. Alastair listened with polite patience, offering brief responses where required, though nothing in their words held the same quiet weight as the two simple ones Margox had offered him earlier. Dinner continued, and the sisters competed in ways only women raised to marry well truly understand. Cordelia steered every conversation toward topics that made her appear clever and worldly. Seraphina filled silences with music and laughter, drawing eyes toward her like a flame draws moths. Margox ate quietly, occasionally glancing toward the windows, as though she would rather be anywhere else. Yet whenever the Duke spoke, even briefly, her eyes would flick toward him, sharp and observant, taking in far more than she let show. At one point, Lord Ashford asked his daughters to entertain their guest with a story from their childhood. Cordelia told a tale designed to highlight her intelligence, describing how she had once outwitted a tutor twice her age. Serafina told a tale of a summer festival where she had charmed an entire village with her singing. When it came to Margox, the room grew awkward, since everyone assumed she would decline to speak. Instead, she surprised them. She wrote something on a small piece of paper, folded it, and asked the servant to pass it to the Duke rather than reading it aloud. Alistair unfolded it and found a short, simple sentence, written in careful handwriting. It described a memory of hiding in the estate garden as a child, watching a fox teach its young how to hunt, and how she had learned that patience often achieves more than noise ever could. He read it twice before looking up. Something about the honesty in those few words struck him more than anything her sisters had said all evening. He thanked her, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Margox quickly looked away, unused to being seen so directly, yet something in her chest tightened in a way she did not expect. The evening rolled on with music and idle conversation, but the atmosphere beneath the surface had shifted. Cordelia noticed the Duke glancing toward Margox more than once, and her jaw tightened with irritation. Serafina noticed it too, though she hid her displeasure behind a wider smile, already planning how she might recapture his attention before the night ended. As dinner concluded, guests moved into the drawing room, where a fire crackled and warmed the air. Alistair found himself seated near Lord Ashford, discussing matters of land and horses, though his attention drifted more than once toward the corner where Margox sat with a book she was not truly reading. She held it more like a wall than an interest, something to hide behind while the room buzzed with conversation she preferred not to join. At one point, a young gentleman from a neighboring estate approached Margox and attempted polite conversation. She answered him kindly but briefly, and he soon wandered off, unsure how to continue speaking with someone who offered so little in return. Alistair watched this exchange with quiet curiosity. He had met dozens of women eager to fill every silence with charm, yet here was one who let silence exist comfortably, without shame or apology. Later, as the guests began preparing to leave, Alistair found himself near the garden doors, needing a moment away from the noise. He stepped outside for fresh air and found, to his surprise, that Margox was already there, standing near a row of rose bushes, looking up at the night sky. She turned when she heard his footsteps, startled but not afraid. For a moment neither spoke. Then Alistair broke the silence himself. "I enjoyed your story about the fox," he said. "It was more honest than anything else I heard tonight." Margox studied him carefully, as though deciding whether to trust his words. Finally, she offered a small, genuine smile, the first one anyone in that garden had seen from her in a long while. "Thank you," she said softly. "Most people find silence uncomfortable. I did not expect you to listen so closely." "I find noise more uncomfortable," he admitted, "especially when it hides more than it reveals." She considered this, then nodded slowly, as though he had said something she agreed with more than she expected to. Their conversation remained short, only a few more exchanged sentences about the garden and the stars above them, yet something about it felt different from every other conversation Alistair had endured that evening. There was no performance here, no attempt to impress, just two people speaking plainly, without pretense. Before either of them could say much more, Lord Ashford called from inside, announcing that carriages were ready for departing guests. Margox excused herself quickly, retreating back into the house with the same quiet grace she carried throughout the evening. Alistair remained in the garden a moment longer, staring at the spot where she had stood, turning her words over in his mind. As his carriage rolled away from Ashford Manor that night, his mother would later ask him which of the three sisters had caught his interest. Cordelia was clever, ambitious, exactly the kind of woman suited to manage a large estate. Serafina was charming, beautiful, the kind of woman who would be admired at every gathering they attended. Yet when Alastair closed his eyes and thought back over the evening, it was not their voices he remembered most clearly. It was a folded piece of paper, a story about a fox, and the quiet weight of two simple words spoken by someone who rarely spoke at all. "Good evening." He did not yet understand why those words stayed with him more than anything else said that night, but he knew, somewhere deep within himself, that this evening had changed something. The three sisters had been introduced to him as potential brides, each one presenting her best qualities in hopes of securing his favor. Yet it was the one who had said the least, who had tried the hardest not to be noticed, who now occupied his thoughts as the carriage rolled through the dark countryside toward home. Behind him, inside Ashford Manor, Cordelia paced her room in frustration, already plotting how to ensure the Duke's next visit centered entirely on her. Serafina hummed softly to herself, confident that her charm would eventually win him over, certain that quiet women rarely held a man's attention for long. And in her own room, Margot sat by her window, staring out at the same stars the Duke had looked at only an hour before, wondering if she had imagined the way his eyes had lingered on her, or if something new and unexpected had truly begun that night. The following morning, news of the dinner spread quickly through the small circle of families who considered themselves close to the Ashfords. A neighbor remarked to Lord Ashford over breakfast that the Duke had seemed unusually attentive throughout the evening, though no one could quite agree on which sister had earned that attention. Cordelia insisted it had clearly been her, citing his interest in her stories of the capital. Serafina countered that his smiles had lingered longest during her laughter at the piano. Margot said nothing at all, choosing instead to slip away to the garden before either sister could draw her into their quiet argument, carrying with her the memory of a folded note and a pair of eyes that had studied her words far more carefully than anyone had in years. None of them knew yet how much this single evening would change the course of all their lives. A scream cut through the afternoon air as a carriage horse reared up near the garden path, its front hooves striking the gravel just steps from where Margot stood frozen. The animal had been startled by a fallen branch, and its handler struggled to regain control while guests scattered in every direction. Alastair, who had arrived at the Ashford estate only minutes earlier for the garden party his mother had arranged with Lord Ashford, moved without thinking. He crossed the distance in a few quick strides, pulled Margot back by the arm, and shielded her as the horse finally settled under its handler's grip. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Margot's heart pounded, not only from the fright of the horse, but from the sudden nearness of the man who had occupied her thoughts since the dinner weeks before. Alastair released her arm slowly, checking to see if she had been harmed, his own pulse still racing from the sudden danger. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, still catching her breath, then managed a quiet answer. "No, thank you." Around them, guests began to recover from the shock, murmuring about the near accident, praising the Duke for his quick action. Cordelia rushed forward, feigning concern for her sister while positioning herself close to Alastair, hoping to be seen as part of the rescue. Serafina arrived moments later, gasping dramatically, declaring how frightened she had been for dear Margot, though her eyes kept drifting toward the Duke rather than her sister. Lord Ashford, embarrassed by the disruption to his carefully planned event, apologized profusely to his guests and ordered the horse led away immediately. The party resumed within the hour, though the mood had shifted. Guests spoke in hushed tones about the incident, and more than one whispered about how quickly the Duke had reacted to protect the quiet Ashford sister rather than either of her more outspoken siblings. As the afternoon continued, tables were set beneath a wide oak tree, and guests mingled over tea and light conversation. Alastair found himself seated near Lord Ashford again, discussing matters of trade and land, yet his attention remained partly on Margot, who sat some distance away, still recovering from the fright of the morning. When a break in conversation allowed it, he excused himself and walked toward her. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. She nodded, offering the same small smile he remembered from the garden weeks earlier. For a while, they sat without speaking, watching the other guests move about the lawn. Then Alistair broke the silence, careful and gentle in his tone. "You handled that fear well," he said. "Many people would have panicked longer." "I have learned to stay calm," she answered. "It is easier than most people think, once you accept that panic rarely changes the outcome." He studied her for a moment, struck again by the thoughtful way she chose her words, using few of them yet saying more than most people managed with many. Their conversation continued slowly, touching on simple subjects at first: the weather, the garden, the books she enjoyed reading in her quiet hours. Gradually, the conversation deepened, and Alistair found himself asking questions he had never thought to ask any other woman before. "Why do you speak so rarely?" he asked eventually, his tone careful, not wanting to offend her. Margox considered the question for a long moment before answering. She was used to people avoiding the subject entirely, or whispering about it behind her back, but never asking her directly with such genuine curiosity. "When I was young, I became very ill," she explained. "My voice was affected for a long time afterward. It grew easier to listen than to speak, and somewhere along the way, listening became a habit I preferred. People often mistake silence for emptiness. I have found it usually means the opposite." Alistair nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He thought of his own life, filled with constant noise, endless expectations from his mother, from society, from men seeking his favor and women seeking his hand in marriage. The idea of choosing silence, of finding strength within it rather than emptiness, struck him as something rare and valuable. "I think I understand," he said quietly. "Sometimes the loudest rooms feel the emptiest." Margox looked at him with surprise, as though she had not expected him to grasp her meaning so easily. For the first time since they had met, she allowed herself to study his face openly, searching for signs of mockery or pity, finding none. Only genuine interest remained in his expression, and it unsettled her in a way she had not felt before. Their conversation was interrupted when Serafina approached, carrying a small basket of flowers she claimed to have gathered specifically to share with the Duke. She launched into a lively description of each flower's meaning, clearly hoping to draw his attention away from her sister. Alistair listened politely, complimenting her effort, though his responses remained brief. When Serafina finally moved on to greet other guests, he turned back to Margox, only to find that Cordelia had arrived as well, inserting herself into the conversation with a story about a recent trip to the city, emphasizing her sophistication and wit. Margox used the distraction to quietly excuse herself, retreating toward the house under the pretense of fetching a shawl. Alistair watched her go, aware that her sisters had successfully redirected his attention, at least for the moment, though his thoughts remained with the quiet woman who had just left rather than the two competing loudly for his favor beside him. 3 mornings later, Alistair found himself riding along the eastern edge of the Ashford estate long before most of the household would have risen, drawn there by a comment Margox had made in passing about the quiet hour before dawn. He told himself the early ride was simply for the fresh air, though he knew well enough that hope had guided his direction more than habit. He found her exactly where he suspected she might be, walking slowly along a narrow path bordered by tall grass, a shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders against the morning chill. She startled slightly at the sound of hooves, then relaxed when she recognized him, though a flush of surprise colored her cheeks. "I did not expect company at this hour," she said. "Nor did I expect to find such good company waiting," he replied, dismounting and leading his horse alongside her at a slow pace. They walked together for nearly an hour as the sky lightened from gray to soft gold, speaking little at first, content simply to share the quiet morning between them. Margox pointed out a heron standing motionless near the shallow stream that cut through the eastern fields, explaining that she often watched it fish in the early hours, admiring its patience. Alistair found himself more interested in watching her watch the bird than in the heron itself, struck again by how fully present she seemed in these small, quiet moments, unburdened by the performance she felt obligated to maintain in crowded rooms. "Do you always walk alone?" he asked eventually. "Always," she admitted. "My sisters prefer to sleep until the sun is well up. My father rises early for business matters, but rarely for pleasure. I have grown used to enjoying mornings by myself." "You do not have to any longer," Alistair said quietly, the words slipping out before he had fully considered them. Margox glanced at him, surprise and something warmer flickering across her face, though she said nothing in response, only allowing a small smile to answer for her. They continued walking until the estate began to stir behind them, at which point Alistair reluctantly excused himself, promising, without quite stating it directly, that this would not be the last quiet morning they shared together. Later that evening, after most guests had departed, Alistair remained behind briefly at Lord Ashford's invitation to discuss a matter of business regarding shared land boundaries between their estates. As the conversation concluded, he found himself walking past the study, where he noticed Margox through a partially open door, sitting at a small desk, writing in a leather-bound journal. He paused, unsure whether to interrupt, but something in her posture, so at ease and unguarded, held his attention. She noticed him after a moment and looked up, startled but not alarmed. "I did not mean to intrude," he said quickly. "You are not intruding," she replied, closing the journal gently. "I often come here when the house grows too loud for my liking." He stepped inside, glancing at the shelves of books lining the walls. "Your father has quite a collection," he observed. "Most of these are mine," she said, a note of quiet pride in her voice. "My father allows me to keep them here, since my own room grew too full to hold them all." Alistair smiled, genuinely curious now. "What do you enjoy reading most?" he asked. "Stories where the quiet characters matter as much as the loud ones," she answered simply. The comment landed with unexpected weight, and Alistair found himself chuckling softly, appreciating both her wit and the truth hidden within it. Their conversation continued for nearly half an hour, touching on books, on her memories of the garden, on small details of her life that she rarely shared with anyone outside her immediate family. He learned that she often walked along the eastern edge of the estate at dawn, when the house was still asleep, and she could enjoy the quiet without interruption. He learned that she disliked large gatherings intensely, though she endured them out of duty to her father, who worried constantly about her future. As their conversation deepened, Alistair felt something shift within himself, a growing certainty that the connection forming between them was unlike anything he had experienced with the countless other women he had met throughout his life as an eligible duke. There was no performance here, no attempt to win his favor through charm or beauty. Only two people speaking honestly, drawn together by genuine curiosity rather than obligation. Eventually, the hour grew late, and Alistair reluctantly excused himself, aware that propriety demanded he not linger too long in private conversation with an unmarried woman, however innocent their exchange had been. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the study door and turned back toward her. Before he could take his leave, he lingered a moment longer near the shelves, running a finger along the spines of several worn books, noticing how carefully she had arranged them, not by size or color as many households preferred for display, but by subject, clearly organized for someone who intended to actually read them rather than simply admire their appearance on a shelf. "You have read all of these," he said, more statement than question. "Most twice," she admitted, a note of quiet pride slipping into her voice. "Some 3 times when the world outside grows too loud to bear." He smiled at that, something in her honesty settling comfortably alongside his own growing fondness for her company. "Perhaps you might lend me one someday," he offered. "I confess my own library has grown dusty from neglect." "Only if you promise to tell me honestly whether you enjoyed it," she replied. "I have little patience for polite lies about books." "I would not dream of insulting you with one," he said, and meant it entirely. "Would you permit me to write to you?" he asked, his tone careful, respectful of the delicate nature of his request. Margox hesitated, aware of what such correspondence might imply, aware too of how her sisters would react if they discovered it. Yet something in her wanted to accept, wanted to continue the rare feeling of being truly seen by someone who valued her exactly as she was. "I would like that," she finally answered. He nodded, satisfaction and something warmer flickering behind his eyes, before bidding her a proper farewell and departing into the evening. Margox remained in the study long after he left, staring at the door, replaying their conversation in her mind, allowing herself a small measure of hope she had not felt in a very long time. That night back at his own estate, Alistair sat at his writing desk far longer than the task required, discarding 2 attempts before settling on words that felt honest without overstepping the careful boundaries expected of a gentleman corresponding with an unmarried woman. He wrote of the heron she had shown him, admitting he had thought of her patience with the bird more than once since their walk. He wrote of a book he had recently finished, one he suspected she might enjoy, and asked, carefully, whether she might tell him of another she treasured in return. He signed the letter simply, sealed it, and handed it to his own steward the following morning with instructions that it be delivered directly to Ashford Manor without delay, unaware that a young maid inside that household would soon intercept it before it ever reached the woman it was intended for. Meanwhile, in another wing of the house, Cordelia paced restlessly, having noticed the Duke's prolonged absence during his farewell to Lord Ashford. She questioned a servant, learning that he had been seen near the study, and her suspicion toward her youngest sister deepened into something colder and more determined. Serafina, upon hearing the same news from Cordelia, felt her earlier confidence waver slightly, though she quickly reassured herself that charm and beauty would ultimately triumph over quiet plainness. Neither sister yet understood the depth of the connection forming between the Duke and Margox, nor how far they would eventually go to interfere with it once they realized the true threat she posed to their own ambitions. For now, the seeds of jealousy had only begun to take root, quiet and unnoticed, much like the woman they were beginning to resent. The letter tore easily in Serafina's hands, the wax seal cracking apart as she read the first line before her sister Cordelia even finished lighting the candle beside her. 3 letters had arrived from Duke Alistair Vance over the past 2 weeks, each addressed clearly to Margox, each intercepted before reaching her by a maid loyal to Cordelia in exchange for a small sum of money. Cordelia read over her sister's shoulder, her expression tightening with every line, every gentle word the Duke had written to a woman she considered far beneath his attention. "He asks about her garden walks," Serafina muttered, disbelief coloring her voice. "He asks about her books. He writes as though she were the only interesting woman in the entire county." Cordelia snatched the letter from her hands, reading it once more before folding it sharply. "This ends now," she said. "We did not spend years preparing ourselves to be overlooked for a girl who barely speaks." They agreed quickly on a plan. The letters would continue to be intercepted, read, then destroyed, ensuring Margox never learned of the Duke's continued interest. At the same time, they would begin spreading careful words among their social circle, planting doubts about Margox's suitability as a future duchess, doubts wrapped in false concern rather than open cruelty. The kind of rumors that spread quickly precisely, because they never seemed like attacks at all. The plan required cooperation from someone inside the household who handled the daily post, and Cordelia had already identified the perfect candidate. A young maid named Alice, recently hired and still uncertain of her place within the strict household hierarchy, collected letters each morning from the messenger who rode out from the county post house. Cordelia approached her quietly one afternoon in the linen room, speaking in the gentle, persuasive tone she reserved for moments when she needed something from someone beneath her. "There is no harm in it," Cordelia had said, pressing a small pouch of coins into the girl's hand. "My sister is easily overwhelmed by attention. I am only sparing her the burden of a correspondence she is not equipped to manage. Bring any letters addressed to her to me first, before they reach her hands, and no one need ever know." Alice had hesitated, some instinct warning her the request carried more weight than Cordelia suggested. Yet the coins were more than she earned in a month of steady work, and the promise of secrecy felt, at the time, like a small enough price to pay. She agreed, and from that day forward, every letter bearing the Vance seal found its way to Cordelia's hands long before Margox ever knew of its existence. Within days, whispers began circulating through the county. At a small gathering hosted by a neighboring family, a guest mentioned to Lady Eleanor Vance, the Duke's mother, that the youngest Ashford girl had always been considered fragile, prone to spells of weakness since her childhood illness, and that some wondered whether she possessed the strength required to manage a household as large as the Vance estate. Lady Eleanor, though skeptical of gossip, filed the comment away with quiet concern, unaware that the words had been carefully placed by Cordelia's own hand through a mutual acquaintance. The following week, a similar comment reached the ears of a respected physician who occasionally attended social functions alongside Lady Eleanor, this one suggesting that the youngest Ashford daughter's continued silence might indicate a lingering affliction of the mind rather than simply the throat, a far more damaging suggestion than anything spoken before. Lady Eleanor, upon hearing this second account, grew genuinely troubled, no longer able to dismiss the matter as idle chatter among bored acquaintances. She resolved privately to look into the matter herself before allowing her son's attachment to progress any further, unaware that she was, in this way, playing directly into the very scheme Cordelia had hoped to set in motion. Meanwhile, Margox grew increasingly confused and hurt by the sudden silence from Alastair. After their meaningful conversation in the study, she had expected at least some word from him, some sign that their connection had been as significant to him as it had been to her. When days turned into weeks without any letter arriving, she began to doubt herself, wondering if she had misread his intentions entirely, if perhaps his kindness that evening had simply been politeness rather than genuine interest. She did not know that every letter he sent had been destroyed before reaching her hands. She did not know that Alastair himself had grown equally confused, having received no response to any of his 3 letters, each one growing slightly more direct than the last, expressing his hope to visit again soon and continue their conversations. He began to wonder if he had misjudged her interest, if her willingness to speak with him that evening had simply been politeness rather than genuine connection. The uncertainty between them created exactly the opening Cordelia and Seraphina had hoped for. With Margox withdrawing further into herself, believing the Duke had lost interest, and with the Duke growing hesitant himself, believing his attention was unwelcome, both sisters seized the moment to insert themselves more aggressively into any social event where he might be present. At a musical evening hosted by Lord Ashford 3 weeks later, Alastair arrived hopping for another quiet conversation with Margox, only to find her seated far from the main gathering, her expression guarded in a way he had not seen since their first meeting. Cordelia intercepted him before he could approach her sister, engaging him in a lengthy discussion about a recent political matter, clearly designed to showcase her intelligence and keep him occupied. When he finally extracted himself politely, Seraphina appeared with a request that he join her at the piano, insisting the guests would enjoy hearing a duet between them. Throughout the evening, every attempt Alastair made to speak privately with Margox was interrupted, either by one sister or the other, until he began to wonder if she herself was avoiding him deliberately. When he finally managed a brief moment alone with her near the refreshment table, her responses felt clipped, distant, nothing like the warmth he remembered from their previous conversations. "Have I done something to offend you?" he asked directly, unable to bear the sudden coldness between them. Margox studied him carefully, searching for insincerity but finding only genuine confusion in his expression. "I wrote to you nothing," he continued before she could answer. "I sent letters, 3 of them, hoping you might respond when you were ready. When I heard nothing, I assumed you preferred I not continue." Margot's eyes widened with shock. "I received no letters," she said quietly, her voice carrying an edge of alarm now. "Not one." They stared at each other, the same realization dawning on both of them simultaneously. Someone had interfered. Someone had deliberately kept them apart. Neither needed to say the names aloud, though both understood immediately who was most likely responsible. Before they could discuss the matter further, Cordelia approached again, this time with less subtlety, practically pulling Alistair away under the pretense of introducing him to an important guest from the city. Margot watched him go, her mind racing, anger building steadily beneath her usually calm exterior. For the first time in years, she felt something stronger than her habitual desire to remain quiet and unnoticed. She felt the urge to fight for something she wanted. That night, after the guests had departed, Margot confronted the household staff quietly, asking careful questions about any letters that may have arrived for her recently. A young maid, racked with guilt after weeks of accepting money from Cordelia in exchange for her silence, finally broke down and confessed everything. She described how Cordelia had intercepted each letter as it arrived, reading them aloud to Serafina before destroying them entirely. Margot sat in stunned silence after the maid finished speaking, the full weight of her sister's betrayal settling over her. She had known Cordelia to be sharp and ambitious, known Serafina to be vain and competitive, but she had never imagined either of them capable of something this deliberate, this cruel. She considered confronting them directly, imagining the satisfaction of finally speaking her mind after years of staying quiet to keep peace within the household. Yet as she sat alone in her room that night, doubt crept in alongside her anger. Perhaps, she reasoned, it would be easier to simply let the matter rest. Perhaps she was not truly suited to be a duchess, as the rumors suggested. Perhaps her sisters, however unkind their methods, were simply protecting her from a future she was not equipped to handle. The old habits of self-doubt, cultivated over years of being overlooked and underestimated, threatened to pull her back into silence and retreat. That same week, at the small market in the village nearest the estate, 2 shopkeepers' wives spoke in hushed tones near a stall selling ribbons and thread, unaware that Margot's own housekeeper stood only a few paces away, selecting fabric for mending. One woman remarked that she had heard from a cousin in service at a neighboring house that the youngest Ashford girl was so delicate in both body and mind that her own family worried constantly for her well-being, and that any man foolish enough to marry her would find himself burdened rather than blessed. The housekeeper, loyal to the Ashford family for over a decade, returned home troubled, uncertain whether to repeat such cruel words to anyone, yet unable to shake the worry that the rumor had traveled further than anyone in the household yet realized. The following morning, however, brought an unexpected visitor. Alistair arrived at Ashford Manor early, before proper visiting hours, insisting on speaking with Lord Ashford immediately regarding a serious matter. Lord Ashford, confused by the urgency, welcomed him into his study, where Alistair explained calmly but firmly what he suspected regarding the missing letters, and the rumors that had begun spreading about Margot's suitability as a bride. Lord Ashford listened with growing concern, though he initially hesitated to believe his own daughters capable of such deception. Alistair, however, had already spoken briefly with the same guilty maid before arriving, having sought her out the previous evening after growing suspicious himself, when a mutual friend mentioned overhearing troubling rumors about Margot's character at a recent gathering. The maid, already burdened by her earlier confession to Margot, repeated the same story to the Duke, providing enough detail to leave little room for doubt. Lord Ashford summoned both Cordelia and Serafina to his study immediately, his expression grave in a way neither daughter had seen in years. When confronted directly, Serafina attempted to deny everything, insisting the maid must be lying or mistaken, yet her voice trembled with obvious guilt. Cordelia, cornered and unable to escape the mounting evidence against her, finally admitted to intercepting the letters, though she attempted to justify her actions by claiming she had only been protecting the family's reputation, worried that Margox's silence would embarrass them all in front of the Duke and his mother. Alistair, who had remained silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. Margox's silence has never embarrassed anyone, he said firmly. It embarrasses only those too shallow to see the strength within it. I did not seek out your family hopping to find the loudest voice in the room. I sought honesty, and I found it in the one sister neither of you seemed to value at all. Why, Lord Ashford asked his eldest daughter, his voice heavy with disappointment. Why would you do this to your own sister? Cordelia's composure cracked slightly under her father's stare. Because no one ever asks what it costs me to stand beside her, she said, her voice rising. Every room we enter, people whisper about her illness, her silence, and I am left explaining, apologizing, smoothing over a reputation I did nothing to damage. I did not want her silence to cost me my own future as well. That is not her burden to carry, Alistair said firmly, though not unkindly, nor is it a reason to steal her happiness to protect your own. Serafina, who had remained quiet throughout most of the exchange, finally spoke, her voice smaller than usual. I only wanted him to notice me the way he notices her, she admitted. I did not think of what it would cost Margox until it was already done. Lord Ashford rubbed his temples, exhausted by the unfolding scene. Cordelia's face flushed with humiliation, while Serafina looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Lord Ashford, ashamed of his daughter's behavior, apologized profusely to the Duke, promising that such interference would never happen again. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the household, and by the time Margox learned what had transpired, she felt a strange mixture of vindication and disbelief. She had spent so many years assuming her own worth was limited, shaped by rumors and quiet dismissals from those around her, that she struggled now to accept that someone had fought so directly on her behalf, someone who barely knew her, yet valued her more than her own sisters ever had. That afternoon, Alistair requested a private audience with her, granted reluctantly by Lord Ashford given recent events, though he remained within sight in the adjoining room out of proper caution. Margox entered the drawing room slowly, uncertain what to say after everything that had unfolded. I am sorry, Alistair began immediately, before she could speak. I should have come to you the moment I suspected something was wrong, rather than allowing so much time to pass in silence between us. Margox studied him carefully, searching for any hint of pity in his expression, finding instead only sincerity and quiet determination. You did not need to defend me so publicly, she said softly. My sisters will resent me even further now. Perhaps, he acknowledged, but I would rather they resent you for something true than allow lies to continue shaping how others see you. You deserve better than quiet suffering disguised as peace. Margox felt something loosen within her chest, a tightness she had carried for years beginning to ease slightly. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that perhaps she was not simply the overlooked sister, the quiet afterthought in a household built around louder personalities. Perhaps she was someone worth defending, worth fighting for, exactly as she was. She asked him, after a long pause, why he had gone to such lengths on her behalf, seeking out the maid himself, confronting her sisters so directly rather than simply allowing the matter to fade quietly, as so many disputes among families often did. Because silence, when it is chosen, deserves respect, he answered. But silence forced upon someone through deception deserves none at all. I could not stand by and allow either of your sisters to decide, on your behalf, which version of yourself the world was permitted to see. Margox considered his words carefully, turning them over in her mind long after their conversation ended that afternoon. She had spent so much of her life believing that her quietness made her a burden others tolerated rather than a person others might actively choose to defend. The idea that someone found her worth protecting, not out of pity, but out of genuine respect, settled slowly into her heart, reshaping something she had believed fixed about herself since childhood. As their conversation continued, gentle and unhurried, neither of them yet realized that this confrontation, however painful, had only strengthened the bond between them. Nor did they realize that Cordelia and Serafina, humiliated but far from finished, were already beginning to consider new ways to reclaim what they still believed was rightfully theirs. A carriage bearing the Vance family crest arrived at Ashford Manor without warning, and Lord Ashford rushed to greet it himself, surprised to find Lady Eleanor Vance stepping down, her expression composed but clearly purposeful. She had heard enough rumors over recent weeks to grow concerned about her son's evident attachment to the youngest Ashford daughter, and she had decided the matter required her personal attention rather than second-hand accounts from acquaintances at social gatherings. Lord Ashford welcomed her inside, sending word immediately for Margox to join them in the drawing room. Margox arrived nervous but composed, aware of the significance of this unexpected visit. She had heard enough about Lady Eleanor's sharp mind and protective nature toward her only son to understand that this meeting would determine much about her future, regardless of how Alastair himself felt toward her. Lady Eleanor studied Margox carefully as she entered, taking in her quiet posture, her simple dress, the calm way she moved despite the obvious tension in the room. After a long silence, Lady Eleanor finally spoke. "I have heard many things about you these past weeks," she said, her tone neither warm nor hostile, simply direct. "Some say you are fragile, others say you are strange, unable to hold a proper conversation. My son, however, speaks of you as though you were the most remarkable woman he has ever encountered. I find myself needing to understand which version is true." Margox felt her pulse quicken, yet she forced herself to remain steady, remembering Alastair's words from days before, the idea that she deserved better than quiet suffering disguised as peace. She took a slow breath before answering. "I cannot speak for what others say of me," she began carefully. "My voice does not come easily, and I have learned to live within that limitation rather than fight against it constantly. If that makes me fragile in the eyes of others, I cannot change their opinion. But I do not believe silence and weakness are the same thing." Lady Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing some of her earlier skepticism. "Tell me about your illness," she said, "not the rumors, the truth from you directly." Margox hesitated, aware that few people had ever asked her this directly, most preferring to whisper about her condition rather than address it openly. Yet something about Lady Eleanor's steady gaze encouraged honesty rather than fear. "When I was 7 years old," she explained, "a fever spread through our household. My younger cousin did not survive it. I nearly did not either. When I recovered, my voice remained weak for nearly 2 years afterward, and even now, speaking too much or too quickly causes me pain in my throat that most people cannot see. I learned to choose my words carefully. Not because I lack thoughts, but because each word costs me more effort than it costs others." Lady Eleanor listened without interrupting, her expression softening gradually as Margox continued, describing how the isolation of those recovery years had shaped her into someone who valued careful observation over hurried speech, who found comfort in books and quiet gardens rather than crowded ballrooms. She spoke of the loneliness of being misunderstood by nearly everyone around her, including her own sisters, who had grown embarrassed by her condition rather than protective of it. By the time Margox finished speaking, Lady Eleanor's earlier reservations had softened considerably, replaced by something closer to genuine respect. She had expected to find a frail, uncertain girl, easily overwhelmed by the responsibilities of managing a large estate. Instead, she found someone who had faced genuine hardship and emerged with quiet strength rather than bitterness. "I see now why my son speaks of you so highly," Lady Alina finally said. "Strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply endures quietly for years, without anyone noticing until the right person finally does." Lady Alina leaned forward slightly, her tone gentler now than when she had first arrived. "And what of the rumor suggesting your condition affects your mind as well as your voice?" she asked directly, watching closely for any reaction. Margox met her gaze steadily, though the question stung. "My mind is quite sound," she answered. "If it were not, I doubt I would have noticed how carefully that particular rumor was worded to cause the most damage possible, nor guessed rather easily who benefits most from its spread." Lady Alina's brow lifted slightly, a flicker of approval passing over her features at the calm sharpness of the response. "That is a fair point, well made," she admitted. "I have met many young women who speak a great deal and say very little of substance. You speak rarely, yet everything you offer carries weight. I begin to understand my son's fondness rather better than I did upon arriving." Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, touching on the responsibilities Margox would face as a duchess, should things progress that far between her and Alistair. Lady Alina asked pointed questions about her ability to manage household affairs, to host important guests, to represent the Vance family name with dignity. Margox answered each question thoughtfully, acknowledging her limitations honestly while demonstrating a clarity of thought that clearly impressed the older woman more with each passing exchange. Just as their conversation was nearing its conclusion, Serafina entered the drawing room uninvited, having learned of Lady Alina's visit and determined not to be excluded from such an important opportunity. She greeted Lady Alina warmly, launching immediately into charming conversation, clearly hopping to redirect attention toward herself before the visit ended. Lady Alina listened politely for several minutes, though her earlier warmth toward Margox had already established a clear impression in her mind. When Serafina finally paused for breath, Lady Alina addressed her directly. "You speak beautifully, my dear," she said, her tone polite but firm. "But I have come today to understand your sister, not to be entertained. I believe I have learned what I needed to know." Serafina's smile faltered slightly, sensing the shift in the room, though she recovered quickly enough to maintain her composure until Lady Alina departed shortly afterward, promising to discuss the visit with her son upon her return home. Later that same afternoon, Lord Ashford found his youngest daughter alone in the library, still turning over the morning's conversation in her mind. He sat beside her quietly, something he rarely did, having always assumed she preferred solitude to company, even his own. "I should have defended you more often over the years," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar weight of regret. "I told myself I was keeping peace in this house by allowing your sisters to speak over you, to shield you from attention you seemed uncomfortable receiving. I see now, I only taught them that your feelings mattered less than theirs." Margox studied her father's face, surprised by the sincerity in his admission. "You did what you believed was kindest," she said softly. "I never blamed you for their behavior." "Perhaps you should have," he answered. "A father ought to notice when one child grows louder by standing on the silence of another. I did not notice quickly enough. I am noticing now." She reached over and took his hand, a small gesture, yet one that carried more warmth between them than years of careful politeness had managed. "Thank you for noticing at all," she said. "It is not too late." Lord Ashford nodded, blinking back an emotion he rarely allowed himself in front of his children, before rising and leaving her to her thoughts once more, though something between them had shifted gently that afternoon, a small repair in a bond long left unattended. That evening, Alistair arrived at Ashford Manor, having heard from his mother's messenger that the visit had gone well, though he remained anxious to hear the details directly. He found Margox in the garden, seated near the same rose bushes where they had first spoken privately months before. "Your mother is quite formidable," Margot said as he approached, a small smile tugging at her lips. "She is," he agreed, settling onto the bench beside her. "But formidable people recognize strength when they see it. I suspect that is exactly what happened today." Margot studied him for a long moment before speaking again, her expression more open than he had seen it before. "I told her about my illness," she admitted, "about my cousin, about the years I spent recovering. I have never spoken of it so openly with anyone outside my immediate family." Alistair reached over gently, taking her hand in his, a small gesture that carried significant weight given the careful boundaries of their courtship thus far. "Thank you for trusting her with that," he said quietly, "and for trusting me, simply by allowing me to know you as fully as you have." Margot felt tears gathering unexpectedly, surprised by the depth of emotion his simple words stirred within her. For years, she had assumed her illness, and its lingering effects made her less desirable, less capable, a burden rather than a person worthy of genuine affection. Yet here, in this quiet garden, she felt for the first time that someone saw her condition not as a flaw to overcome, but simply as part of who she was, neither diminishing nor defining her entirely. "I feared you would eventually tire of my silence," she admitted softly. "That eventually you would prefer someone who could offer you easier conversation, easier company." Alistair shook his head firmly. "I have known women who fill every silence with clever words," he said. "Their conversation is easy, yes, but it rarely stays with me afterward. Yours does. Every word you choose to share carries weight precisely because you choose it so carefully. I would rather have a handful of honest words from you than an entire evening of empty charm from anyone else." She asked him once, quietly, whether he ever grew impatient waiting for her to find the right words during their conversations, whether the pauses she needed ever felt tiresome to him, the way she suspected they had to others in the past. "Never," he said simply. "I would rather wait for your true thought than rush past it toward something easier. Patience is a small price for honesty." Margot's tears finally fell, though they carried relief rather than sorrow, and Alistair gently wiped one away with his thumb, the tenderness of the gesture settling something deep within both of them. For the first time since their initial meeting, neither felt the need to guard themselves carefully against disappointment. The rumors, the interfered letters, the doubts planted by jealous sisters, none of it had managed to break the genuine connection steadily growing between them. Meanwhile, within the manor, Cordelia and Serafina sat together in tense silence, both aware that their earlier schemes had failed entirely, both aware that Lady Aliner's approval had shifted decisively in Margot's favor. Yet neither sister was prepared to accept defeat so easily. As the household settled into evening quiet, Cordelia began outlining one final plan, one last opportunity to reclaim what she still believed rightfully belonged to the eldest daughter of the family, regardless of how thoroughly their previous attempts had failed. She would need something more drastic this time, something that could not be easily traced back to her, something that would force Margot to publicly demonstrate the very weakness the rumors had always suggested. An upcoming ball, hosted by Lady Aliner herself to formally introduce potential matches for her son, presented exactly the opportunity Cordelia had been waiting for. "We cannot intercept another letter," Serafina said quietly, still nervous from their recent exposure. "Father watches us both too closely now." "We will not need to," Cordelia answered, a cold calm settling over her features. "At the ball, Lady Aliner intends to invite young ladies to perform for the gathered guests. If Margot is asked to speak before a crowd of strangers, her voice will fail her, exactly as it always has. No one will need to whisper the rumor afterward. They will have seen it with their own eyes." Serafina hesitated, some remaining trace of guilt tugging at her conscience. "And if the Duke defends her again, as he did before?" Cordelia's expression hardened further. Then he will learn, in front of everyone who matters, precisely what kind of wife he has chosen. Either way, this ends the matter. I do not intend to lose everything to a girl who can barely speak her own name." With that final resolve settled between them, the sisters turned their attention toward the preparations for the coming ball, each convinced that this last effort would finally restore what they believed the household owed them, unaware of how thoroughly their scheme would unravel before the night was through. The ballroom advance hall blazed with candlelight, hundreds of flames reflecting off polished floors and crystal chandeliers, while musicians tuned their instruments in preparation for the evening ahead. Lady Alina had spared no expense in organizing this event, officially framed as a celebration of the coming season, though everyone in attendance understood its true purpose. This was the evening the Duke would likely signal his intentions publicly, and every unmarried woman within the county had arrived dressed in her finest, hoping to be the one he chose to notice above all others. Margox arrived with her father and sisters, dressed simply compared to the elaborate gowns worn by Cordelia and Serafina, yet carrying herself with a quiet confidence that had grown steadily over recent months. She no longer flinched at the whispers that followed her through crowded rooms, no longer assumed every glance carried judgment rather than curiosity. Alistair's steady presence in her life had given her something she had lacked for years, a sense that her worth did not depend entirely on how loudly she could announce herself to the world. Cordelia watched her younger sister move through the entrance hall with growing resentment, her earlier failures still burning within her. She had spent the past several days finalizing her plan alongside Serafina, both sisters now united by desperation rather than genuine sisterly bond. Tonight, they intended to ensure Margox's supposed weakness would be impossible for anyone, including the Duke himself, to overlook or forgive. As the evening progressed, guests mingled beneath the glittering chandeliers, engaging in polite conversation while musicians filled the air with gentle melodies. Alistair sought out Margox early, guiding her through a slow dance despite her initial hesitation, aware that every eye in the room watched them closely. She moved carefully, following his lead, grateful that dancing required little conversation, allowing her to simply enjoy the closeness of his hand against hers without the pressure of finding perfect words. "You seem less nervous than I expected," he murmured as they turned slowly across the floor. "I have decided that, whatever they whisper tonight, it will not be worse than what they have already whispered for years," she answered. "I would rather face it standing beside you than hiding in a corner alone." He tightened his hold on her hand slightly, pride and affection mingling plainly in his expression, and for the remainder of the dance neither of them paid any mind at all to the watching crowd. Guests from every corner of the county filled the hall that night, drawn by curiosity as much as celebration. Two elderly matrons seated near the refreshment table exchanged quiet opinions about which young woman the Duke seemed most drawn toward, one insisting it would surely be one of the elder Ashford sisters, given their beauty and social grace, the other recalling rumors of a quieter connection that had formed months earlier. A group of young gentlemen near the terrace doors discussed the evening's likely outcome with the easy confidence of men who had never once considered how closely their idle wagers might wound the very woman they discussed so carelessly. Margox, aware of the attention gathering around her simply for standing beside the Duke, felt the old instinct to retreat rising within her, yet she found she no longer wished to disappear from rooms the way she once had. She remained close to Alistair throughout most of the evening, drawing quiet strength from his steady presence beside her, even as she noticed her sisters watching from across the room with expressions she could not quite read. Midway through the evening, Lady Alina called for a brief pause in the dancing, announcing that several young ladies present had prepared performances to share with the gathered guests, a tradition common at such important events. Serafina stepped forward eagerly, performing a lovely piece on the piano that drew warm applause from the crowd. Cordelia followed with a recitation of poetry, delivered with practiced elegance that impressed several older guests watching from nearby seats. Then, before Lady Alina could move the evening forward, Cordelia spoke up once more, her voice carrying false sweetness across the room. "Surely our dear sister Margox would like to share something as well," she said, gesturing toward her younger sibling with an expression of feigned encouragement. "She has kept herself so quiet all evening. Perhaps a short recitation, or even a simple song, would allow everyone here to appreciate her hidden talents." The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward Margox, who felt her chest tighten with sudden panic. She understood immediately what her sister intended. A public performance, demanding sustained speech or song in front of dozens of unfamiliar guests, would strain her voice considerably, likely causing visible discomfort or failure in front of everyone whose opinion mattered most to her future. Cordelia had chosen this moment precisely because it offered no graceful escape. Refusing would appear as further evidence of weakness, while attempting would likely result in visible struggle. Margox's mind raced, searching for some way to navigate the trap set before her. She glanced toward her father, who looked helplessly uncertain how to intervene without causing further scandal. She glanced toward Lady Alina, whose expression carried concern rather than judgment, though she too seemed uncertain how to prevent the unfolding situation without appearing to favor one guest over another too obviously. Before Margox could formulate any response, Alistair stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying clear authority across the quiet ballroom. "I believe true talent reveals itself in many forms," he said, addressing the gathered crowd directly. "Not everyone expresses themselves through song or recitation. Some express themselves through the words they choose to write, through the careful thought behind every sentence they offer. I would like to share something with you all, if Margox permits it." He turned toward her, his eyes gentle, silently asking permission. Margox, still shaken but grateful beyond words for his intervention, gave a small nod. Alistair reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, one Margox recognized immediately as the very note she had written him during their first dinner together, describing the fox teaching its young to hunt in the quiet garden of her home. He read the words aloud to the assembled guests, his voice steady and warm, allowing the simple beauty of her writing to fill the silent ballroom. When he finished, a genuine murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd, several guests nodding thoughtfully at the quiet wisdom contained within such a brief passage. Cordelia's plan had backfired entirely, transforming what she intended as public humiliation into an unexpected demonstration of Margox's genuine depth and thoughtfulness. Lady Alina stepped forward then, addressing the room with quiet finality. "I have hosted many gatherings over the years," she said. "Rarely have I witnessed something as genuinely moving as what we just heard. Thank you, my dear, for sharing your words, even indirectly, with all of us tonight." Applause spread through the ballroom, warm and sincere, and Margox felt tears gathering in her eyes, though this time they carried gratitude rather than fear. She glanced toward Alistair, silently thanking him for understanding exactly what she needed in that terrifying moment. For finding a way to let her voice be heard without demanding, she strained against her own limitations. Cordelia, humiliated by the complete failure of her scheme, retreated toward the edge of the ballroom, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Serafina, watching the scene unfold, finally understood the depth of the connection between the Duke and their youngest sister, a connection built on genuine understanding rather than superficial charm, one that no scheme or rumor could easily unravel. As the evening continued, Alistair requested a private moment with Lord Ashford, drawing him aside near the edge of the ballroom while the music and conversation continued around them. He asked, plainly and without pretense, for permission to seek Margox's hand in marriage, promising Lord Ashford that he understood fully the quiet strength of the daughter he hoped to marry, and intended to spend a lifetime honoring rather than merely tolerating it. Lord Ashford, moved by the sincerity in the younger man's voice, gripped his hand firmly and gave his blessing without a moment's hesitation, admitting quietly that he could not have hoped for a better match for a daughter he had, for too long, failed to champion as fiercely as she deserved. Their conversation remained brief but significant, and when they returned to the main gathering, both men wore expressions of quiet satisfaction that immediately drew curious glances from nearby guests. Alistair returned to Margox's side, offering his hand once more, though this time he guided her not toward the dance floor, but toward a small balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens below. The noise of the ballroom faded slightly as they stepped outside, replaced by the gentle sound of crickets and distant music drifting through open doors. "I spoke with your father," he said, his tone suddenly more serious than she had heard it before. Margox's heart quickened, sensing the significance of the moment. "I do not seek a duchess who fills every room with noise," he continued, taking both her hands gently in his. "I have spent months learning that the quietest voice in the room often carries the most meaning if only someone takes the time to truly listen. I do not wish to spend my life surrounded by empty charm when I have found something far more valuable in you. Your honesty, your patience, the careful way you choose each word, these are not weaknesses. They are exactly the qualities I did not know I needed until I found them in you." Margox felt her breath catch, hardly daring to believe the direction of his words. "I love you," Alistair said simply, the words carrying more weight for their plainness than any elaborate declaration could have managed. "Not despite your silence, but because of everything your silence has taught me about truly listening. Will you allow me to spend the rest of my life learning to hear you even better than I do now?" Tears fell freely now, and Margox found herself laughing softly through them, an emotion so foreign and overwhelming that she could hardly contain it. She managed only a few words in response, though they carried everything she needed to say. "Yes," she whispered, "I choose you, exactly as loudly or quietly as we need to be." He drew her close, and for a moment the world beyond that small balcony ceased to exist entirely. When they finally returned to the ballroom, hand in hand, the assembled guests immediately understood the significance of their expressions, and a fresh wave of applause and delighted murmurs spread throughout the room. Lady Eleanor smiled warmly, satisfied entirely with the woman her son had chosen, while Lord Ashford beamed with pride, relieved beyond words that his often overlooked daughter had finally found the recognition she deserved. Cordelia and Seraphina stood together near the edge of the room, watching the celebration unfold around their sister with mixed emotions. Their earlier schemes, their jealousy, their determination to see Margox overlooked once more, had all failed entirely against the quiet strength she had carried within herself the entire time. In time, both sisters would come to accept the outcome, humbled by their own behavior and the clear devotion the Duke held for their sibling, though the road toward genuine reconciliation between them would take considerably longer to travel. Word spread quickly through the county in the days following the ball, and the story of the quiet Ashford daughter who had captured the heart of a duke became a favorite topic among households eager for a tale of genuine romance triumphing over vanity and deception. Margox, once dismissed and overlooked by nearly everyone around her, found herself embraced by a life she had never dared imagine for herself, surrounded by a household that valued her exactly as she was, rather than demanding she become someone louder, someone different, to earn the love and respect she deserved. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, an unexpected softness began to settle between Margox and her sisters. Seraphina, freed at last from the constant pressure of competing for a match she had never truly needed, found herself visiting Margox's room some evenings simply to talk, admitting quietly one night that she had always envied how little her younger sister seemed to need anyone's approval, even as she pursued it so desperately herself. Cordelia's pride took longer to soften, yet even she arrived one afternoon with a small gift, a set of fine writing paper, offered without much explanation beyond a mumbled acknowledgment that Margox's letters, however few, had always been worth reading. Their wedding, held several months later in the same gardens where their quiet friendship had first blossomed, remained modest and intimate by choice, a deliberate departure from the loud, elaborate celebrations typically expected of a duke's marriage. Rows of simple white chairs lined the same path where Alastair had once found Margox staring up at the stars, and the same rose bushes, now in full bloom, framed the small gathering of family and close friends who had come to witness the union. Lady Eleanor sat near the front, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Lord Ashford stood ready to walk his youngest daughter down the aisle, his expression carrying more pride than he had shown in years. Margox stood before family and close friends, her voice soft but steady as she exchanged her vows, and for the first time in her life, she felt no fear in the quiet strength of her own words. Beside her, Alastair listened closely to every syllable, exactly as he always had, exactly as he always would, understanding that some of the most important things in life were never meant to be shouted, but simply heard by the one person willing to truly listen. As the small gathering rose in quiet applause, Margox glanced toward her sisters, finding genuine warmth in their expressions at last, and beyond them, toward the garden path where a fox had once taught its young the value of patience. A lesson she now understood had shaped the rest of her life far more than she ever could have imagined on the night she first wrote it down for a stranger who would become her husband.